So let me tell you a story about...
Right hand, left hand.
A story about...
Good and evil.
A story about moral binaries, which have always existed in narratives and for this reason will always be immediately familiar to us. But these days more than ever, our culture seems to be pushing back against this. In mainstream television, the protagonist who the audience is meant to identify with is more and more frequently being characterized as an anti-hero.
Wipe down this!
More time is spent giving comic book villains humanizing and even tragic origin stories. Is it possible that our culture is outgrowing this dynamic? Are the dualisms of good and evil, love and hate, heroes and villains, demons and saints, now registering as reductive or bad storytelling? Well, it is true that certain binary oppositions can have racist or even sexist manifestations. Take the virgin whore dichotomy, for example, where the morality of two women is pitted against each other and is mostly defined by their sexual behavior or how well they perform antiquated gender roles. Or you could look at classic Hollywood films, in which civilized Western saviors are contrasted with Native Americans, Black folks, Arabs, and more, who are portrayed as a savage or dangerous racial other. That being said, I personally wouldn't make the generalization that this is always wrong or overly simplistic, but I will say that a lot of the films that push me to imagine the world more deeply are films that didn't necessarily have clearly defined heroes or villains. And here, the first film that comes to mind is Spike Lee's timeless Do the Right Thing. Do the Right Thing takes place on the hottest day of the year in Bed-Stuy, where mounting racial tensions eventually results in the tragic death of Radio Raheem and the destruction of Sal's Pizzeria. Now, at the time, the film invoked a truly bizarre reaction from certain critics. Some loved the film, some were simply confounded by it, and others went as far as to accuse Spike Lee of fascist propaganda. Some people truly believed that the film was going to incite riots, which of course never actually happened. As time went on, the film was better understood, but even today people seem to struggle with Lee's bold and challenging ending. Mookie's decision to throw the trash can in Sal's Pizzeria left some confused. They saw Sal as a decent person who had an imperfect but genuine relationship with Mookie. So let's take a closer look at the events that led to the ending and the players involved, starting with Sal. Like most of the characters in Do the Right Thing, Sal is complexly drawn, and there are more than a few instances in the narrative where Sal appears to be tolerant and sincere.
I mean, for Christ's sake, Pino, they grew up on my food. On my food. And I'm very proud of that. Well, you may think it's funny, but I'm very proud of that.
But his racism is as clear as it is embedded. So let's go back earlier in the film to the scene where Buggin' Out asks Sal why there are no brothers on the wall. On the one hand, Sal is Italian-American, and the fact that he honors Italian-American icons on his wall is not at all unordinary. But as Buggin' Out points out, Sal's business is entirely dependent on black patrons. To put up a picture of one of the many esteemed black figures of the time as a sign of solidarity and respect to the community would be a nice gesture that could not possibly negatively affect him in any way. But then again, Lee doesn't seem to be interested in clear-cut debates, and the necessity of Buggin' Out's insurrection of Sal's Pizzeria is clouded in ambiguity. In the previous scene, Buggin' Out accuses a white man of scuffing up his sneakers, but if we look closely, we see that the man bumps into Buggin' Out on his left side, but it was the right sneaker that was scuffed. Here, Lee implies that Buggin' Out is not averse to seeking out confrontation, even when it isn't entirely justified. Later, we see that Jade, Mookie's sister, also implies that Buggin' Out's energies may be misdirected.
Jade, you got to be down. What you ain't down?
Yeah, Buggin' Out, I'm down. But I'm down for something positive in the community. Are you down for that?
Jade.
By insinuating that Buggin' Out's motives are somewhat dubious, Spike Lee allows us to think more deeply about the racial dimensions of the conflict rather than to passively identify with one character. So in terms of who's right, Spike Lee does not care to force your hand. But what is worth taking note of in this scene is the disturbing implications of Sal's reaction to Buggin' Out's request.
You making trouble?
Yeah, I'm a troublemaker. I'm making trouble.
You'll be a ball breaker. Always coming in here looking for trouble, huh? Suppose I busted your head. How would you...
The weapon that he carries is also significant. Here, the bat functions as an important symbol of racial violence, as it is an allusion to the Howard Beach incident.
Class neighborhood near Kennedy Airport, and it's known for its hostility to blacks. Last Friday, 3 black men were attacked outside this pizzeria. They'd walked about 3 miles to the pizzeria in search of a telephone after their car broke down. One of the victims, Cedric Sanderford, told reporters the attackers shouted, "Nigger, you're in the wrong neighborhood." He said he was hollering, "God, don't kill us."
Howard Beach is referenced yet again after the central tragedy of the film, the death of Radio Raheem.
They killed him. They killed Radio Raheem! Murder. They did it again, just like Michael Stewart.
But his characterization as a victim of what is essentially a racial hate crime strays far from familiar Hollywood conventions. Radio Raheem more than once is presented in an antagonizing way.
D, motherfucker, D! Learn to speak English first, alright? D!
To illustrate this visually, Radio Raheem is not only shot in Dutch angles, but in extreme close-up with a 10mm wide-angle lens to show how the anger that he has at times overcome with distorts his worldview. The extreme low-angle shots exaggerate his size and presence. Fabe notes that at times Radio Raheem just appears in the frame without any logical entrance, as a ghost would in a nightmare. Especially here, right before the confrontation with Sal that would lead to his death. Radio Raheem is an undisputed victim of racial hatred, but that doesn't mean that he isn't free from his own animosities, and this is actually the case with a lot of the characters in the film.
Victim on Perry Como, Luciano Pavarotti, solo meal non-singer motherfucker.
Hey, me no speaky American, own every fruit and vegetable stand in New York. Bullshit Reverend Sun Young Moon.
Cream drinking, bagel and deluxe, banana for this Jew asshole.
In this way, Spike Lee portrays oppression in its full complexity by exemplifying how oppression perpetuates itself in a menacing cycle of hate and fear, rather than always yielding clear-cut heroes and villains. Now let's go back to that final confrontation with Sal. Radio Raheem, Smiley, and Buggin' Out all show up at Sal's pizzeria to proclaim their boycott. Here, Clyde Taylor notes that although the situation was heated from the very beginning, it is Sal who specifically racializes the conflict. Sal refers to the Fight the Power anthem as jungle music, and after that, it's as if his hidden racial demons just burst through.
Goddamn right, you black cocksucker! I'll fucking tear your fucking nigger ass! You black cocksucker! You nigger motherfucker!
Now it is Sal's callous refusal to acknowledge the tragedy of Radio Raheem's death that pushes the community over the edge.
Do what you gotta do.
The police as well exhibit a complete lack of remorse for what was nothing short of a racially charged killing, a fact that is brutally enforced visually through the shot of Radio Raheem's feet dangling off the ground, which Fabe notes is hauntingly reminiscent of a lynching. The horrific nature of his killing and the grotesque abuse of power from the 2 cops rightfully leaves the community outraged.
As plain as day. They didn't have to kill the boy.
Before he throws the trash can, Mookie bows his head in shame. He is far from the first person we would expect to do this. In fact, Lee chooses this tender conversation to be the last interaction Sal and Mookie have right before the tension explodes.
And Mookie, I want to tell you that there's always going to be a place for you here. Right here at Sal's. Sal's famous pizzeria. Because you've always been like a son to me.
In the way Spike Lee sets up the film, he positions Buggin' Out to be the one to incite the riot. The cognitive dissonance of Mookie being the one to do it, the one that Sal has shown the most affection for, is precisely what engages us to consider the conflict more deeply. And that dissonance, that disorienting feeling that makes us sit up and lean forward extends to Sal and Radio Raheem as well. That the central conflict is between a sympathetic racist and an antagonized victim is not an accident. And it is this very subversion of common storytelling tropes that makes Do the Right Thing the powerful classic that it is. By refusing conventions that pander to what we already know about right and wrong, Spike Lee pushes us to go beyond the boundaries of what we think we know about race and morality. Sometimes you may notice that certain villains in popcorn action flicks and feel-good films are so one-dimensionally evil that it's easy for the audience to feel that justice has been enacted when they are defeated by the good guy. Most movies have to have conflict and hence antagonists to propel the narrative forward, and when terrible things happen to these campy caricatures, we can still come out of the theater feeling good because they may not be totally human to us. The other day, for example, I was watching the Titanic and I found myself automatically identifying with Jack Dawson because he was broadly painted as the heroic figure, especially when contrasted with the deeply unlikable Cal. By the end of the film, I ended up feeling appeased because I related to the good guy, but my morality was left unchallenged and I, as a result, was left unaltered. Like I said earlier, I would never say that this is inherently or always a bad thing, but when it comes to topics like race, there are times when the too limiting moral dichotomy of good and evil of a lot of the films we see not only allows for passive viewing, but doesn't always accurately reflect real life. At times, people seem to be more morally complex than their cinematic counterparts, and in many ways, we are all capable of both good and evil, and we all struggle to do the right thing when circumstances challenge us. When you watch behind-the-scenes footage of the film, it's very apparent that Danny Aiello, who plays Sal, and Spike Lee have very different interpretations of who Sal is.
He's the world's greatest liberal, and I don't know if that's right. We thought, and I thought, he's not a racist. He's a nice guy. He sees people as people.
Well, I think the Sal was a racist. I mean, but Danny didn't.
And it's interesting, because from what I can surmise, Lee kind of lets Aiello play Sal in accordance to his own interpretation, even though they disagree, which in a very odd way enhances the realism of his performance, because like many people in real life, the character of Sal is unaware of his own racism as well. And that's the thing about Sal. He is so far from the cinematic racist that we have become accustomed to. He is too real, too human. By making one of the most seemingly agreeable figures in the film a racist, Lee may be implying that racism is an ugly but deeply common thing that we are all capable of and probably guilty of. That's what makes Do the Right Thing such a disquieting experience. We empathize with Sal. We feel for Sal. Sal is our uncle, our grandmother, our 8th grade history teacher. God forbid Sal is you. God forbid Sal is me. Spike Lee is actively challenging us to ask ourselves this. In these times, it's hard to argue the necessity of films that soothe us about the racial state of America. It feels like we have a greater need for films that make us uncomfortable, films that implicate us, films that wisely withhold answers in order to inspire dialogue. You'll notice in the credits that there are 2 quotes instead of 1. This may be because great political films are not necessarily meant to convert you. They're meant to start a conversation, and that's what Do the Right Thing does.